Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder, and welcome to the next in our video of exploring how to do stuff in React. So in the last video we had these buttons, they weren't styled yet, so now they're styled. So see, the page is starting to take shape. So essentially what's breaking down here is we have this navigation component, and then we have a body component that's really kind of an array of elements that includes this main body component, a component that renders here, and then this component with the three buttons that we can switch between the pages. So last we left off, only this main page worked. I have since then quickly added the blog page. So if I click on the blog page, it takes me to that, and if I click on the contact page, it takes me to that. And again, this is all one big page. That's why it's called a single page application. But see, I can explore the website. And so let's first take a look at the blog page. Okay, so we see is welcome to the blog page, below several blog posts. So what it's doing here, it's actually pulling from an API request. We can actually see the object. I have a console log that shows you the object we're bringing in here that has 7 different blog posts that it's pulling in from. Now, how do we do that? So let's go, oh, not there. Let's go to explore our blog component. So again, I got all my comments, contact page, and I will push this up to Git at some point. So if you go to my GitHub page, Alex Merced Coder is my profile name. You should be able to find, like, it'll probably be called like React tutorial or something like that. So that way you can refer to the code here if you want. So here's my blog page component. So I made it a class component because I did want to be able to use state. Now in the future, eventually we're going to learn hooks, and like React hooks, which are sort of a newer feature in React, has added the ability to kind of use state-like stuff in a functional component, but that we're not quite there yet. So let's walk you through what I did. So what I did is in my state, I have an empty array called blog post in my state, where I plan to store all my blog posts. So my constructor basically just declares that, hey, we have this blog post thing. And then I'm going to define a function to go get those blog posts. So I define an asynchronous function. So if you're not familiar with async await, let's do a quick walkthrough. Now what happens is that when you declare a function and you prefix it with the word async or the keyword async, it says, hey, this function does asynchronous stuff, which means there's parts of it that are going to return promises. Okay, now let me see, do I have the other page open from before? Yeah. So this is from a different project. Like, basically, if you don't use async await, then you would have to go get the API and use promises, which means you would use this fetch, which is an asynchronous function in itself, which returns a promise. So then you have to use this whole .then thing. So it's like .then, and that can be really confusing at times. So async await is sort of the newest version of doing asynchronous stuff in JavaScript that makes it look a lot prettier and easier to understand what's going on. But you have to prefix the function with async to use the await keyword. So we're saying this is an asynchronous function called getPost, and the idea is, the first thing is I'm going to have a variable called response. What response will equal is the result of a promise. That's what this await's saying. It's saying, hey, you know what? The thing that's going to come after the await is going to take a second. It's not going to happen right away. So we're going to assume a promise, and until that promise resolves, don't assign. Once the promise resolves, then assign the resulting value to response. So this fetch function in JavaScript says, hey, go get some stuff. Go get go make a API request, or do some sort of, make some sort of API request, and it all by default makes a get request. So that's why I don't have to put any details as far as what kind of request and request body, which you can do, but that's not the purpose of this particular video. You could use, and you don't have to use fetch. You could use Axios or jQuery, however you prefer to do your AJAX requests. But fetch is built into JavaScript, so I figured that's probably the best way to go. So this basically says, hey, wait till this fetch goes in, because the fetch is going to go contact this URL and go get those blog posts, which may take milliseconds, may take many seconds, may take minutes, depending on what server is reaching out and how quickly it responds. So that's why the wait. So it says, don't do anything don't move further in this function until this thing resolves. So then this resolves, so response now has the data that fetch brought us. So now the thing is that it's not JSON. We want it to be sort of a JavaScript object. Okay. So then I'm going to make a variable called JSON, And JSON is going to equal, well, this. It's going to take the response and then parse the JSON. That's what this does. It's a function built in the JavaScript that takes, you know, some JSON data and then parses that out for you into a JavaScript object, which is what I want. So basically what wait says, we need to wait for this. So basically, since response carries a promise inside of it from this fetch, it's going to wait for this for response to finish before it actually does this. That's what the await's doing for me. So it's going to wait for response to finish, and once response finishes it getting the data, and then it will run this JSON function and then store that data in the JSON variable. Cool. Then I'm going to set state. So since I'm not assigning it to a variable, I just put the await keyword at the beginning. I'm saying await, since I'm using the JSON variable in here, I'm going to put await in the front saying, hey, you have to wait till JSON resolves. You have to wait till this promise kind of hits. So this dot set state, I'm setting the state, and blog post is going to equal whatever JSON results in being. And I only want in that object, technically there's like more stuff inside of it. Really want is a internal object called items. Okay, so inside of it there's actually it's an array that's inside of it called items, and that's what I want. And I'm assigning it to that blog post array that I created earlier. Now every API is different, so you have to know sort of the structure of the data you're getting back from your API. This particular API is from Contentful. It's a headless CMS. So basically what I did is I created a blog on there, a headless blog, and then I can just call and then deliver it this way to give a React front end to that blog. So I'm saying I want that items array to be what blog post is. Okay, so now it gets stored, and just to make sure that that all worked out right, I'll put await again because I want this to make sure this has actually resolved. So await console log this.state.blog post. So it's going to wait for all these awaits are going to wait to finish in that order. So this keeps, because if I don't, like originally I just had a console login component did mount, which I haven't mentioned yet, and it would just error out because it's like, I don't know what this is. What's this? Where's this data? Because it doesn't happen right away. That's the point of asynchronous code. Cool. So that's what this function does. Okay, so I define that function to go get the API data and assign it to my state. But I don't want this to really happen, or I want this to get this data when the component exists. Because right now I'm only defining the function. The function's never been called. So I have to call the function somewhere. And this is where lifecycle methods come into play. There's a couple built-in methods or built-in functions into class components that get called at different points in a component's lifecycle. Like when I'm just using component did mount, which is built into React. What this does is that the minute that the component comes into existence, it's going to run this when anything within this definition at that point. So I'm basically saying when the component mounts, which technically would happen, so just to kind of take a look here, if I were to refresh this. Okay, right now I'm just seeing the main page because the main page variable is true. So it's rendering the main page component. Now if I hit the blog page button, what it's doing is changing those Boolean variables from a few videos ago. So it's making the main page and the contact page false and blog page true, which then renders the blog component. And then it's going to make that, then at that point, the component is being mounted, meaning it's being rendered. So that's when it's going to run that function, or run that component did mount lifecycle function. And that's why it's making that AJAX request there. Here I can see the console log of it. And of course you can see the results right there. So that's component did mount. There's other ones, like you can run ones that only run after it's re-rendered, ones that once the component goes away. So let's take a quick tour, show you the other ones. Okay, rendering elements, lifecycle. This is the React documentation. Let's show you some of the other ones. There's a handful of them, and then some old retired ones. Okay, so we have like component did mount, component will unmount. So I'm looking for some other good ones. Component will unmount. I don't know, we just did that one already. Set state. Okay, well, they're all listed throughout there, so you should read through it. But the idea is that you can have ones that occur at different times, different lifecycle functions. And they'll help you make sure that the actual component does things when you want them to happen. Okay, I mean, again, probably the most useful ones are going to be mount and unmount, because basically You want stuff to happen when the component happens, and you might want things to happen when the component leaves and goes away. So for example, if I were to click on main page, technically the blog page component has unmounted. It's not there anymore. So I could actually define a function to happen when that happens, if I wanted to go put an alert on the screen or whatnot. But that's all this is doing, this lifecycle function here. They're built into React, so you need to kind of know what their names are. Component did mount is the one I'm using. Okay, and the other one I mentioned was component will unmount, which is for when it's going to leave. Okay, and then here, now I can actually go back to my render function, where I'm going to actually render the component and say, hey, I have my parent div, because again, everything has to be wrapped in one parent component. And notice that that's all good. So div class name is my parent component. Inside of it, we have an h1, welcome to the blog page, p, a p tag for saying, hey, so blog post will render. And then again, we use map, kind of like we did earlier when we did the nav. So this .state.blogpost.map. Again, each time we iterate, each item in the array that we just pulled in from the API request, it's called post. And then we can put some JSX in there. And notice, usually when you think of like an arrow function, you think like it would be arrow and then curly brackets, but this is JSX. So you're returning sort of an object, so you need to use the parentheses instead. So I'm wrapping my JSX in parentheses. Okay, so I wrap it in a div because again, just like any JSX, it has to have one parent element. And inside that div, I have an h1 that grabs post, because post is like that particular item element that we're iterating over. There's a sub object called fields, and in there's a property called blog title. How do I know that? That's why I console log things so I can see it. So here's my array that would be under blog post. In there is my 7 blog posts. If I drop one, I see there's another object called fields that has blog content and blog title. It's going to be different from API to API. It's always the fun part of doing AJAX requests, is discovering how to maneuver the data. But post.fields a blog title and then a p tag with the actual blog content there. Cool. And then basically, so now whenever the component renders, again the component did mount, we'll run this get post function that goes and grabs the API, and then the component actually renders onto the screen. Cool. Very neat. That's how you would do that, and that looked pretty cool. Okay, I mean I didn't style it or anything, but you can imagine what you can do. And then I also did the contact page. So a little brief intro to dealing with forms. Check this out. So if I start typing in this field, it's automatically updating the other field. How did we do that? Okay, we'll show you. Okay, and then if I hit submit, a little alert, boop, with that word, and the name was submitted, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's go take a look at our contact page component. So basically what happened is that we're going to we always want really all of our variables eventually get to the state of the component if we're using state. You always hear people when they talk about React is they want state to be sort of the sole source of truth. So you always kind of want data to kind of move up into the state. So let's explore how we constructed this. So we have the constructor. We're going to have a variable called value in the state. That's going to represent the value that's being typed into this input box here. Okay, and then we're going to I created 2 functions. This is pretty much very similar to what's inside the React documentation for this particular topic, which is a minor difference in the way I did it. Okay, so basically I'm going to have one event handler for when we submit the form. That's going to be what sets the alert. And then again, you're passing in the event. The reason is because the form has an event, and a form has its own sort of properties that you can access by passing in, well, event. Okay, so theoretically, whenever you run an event handling function, what you don't realize sometimes is that JavaScript is automatically passing certain data about the event as a parameter into whatever function you use to call that event. So if you want to have access to that data, you have to create a parameter inside the event. And you don't need to define it later because it's automatically defined for you. It's automatically passed in the event handler. So that's why I don't have to type in like this dot handle submit and then put in parentheses the parameter that's being passed in. JavaScript's going to do that for you. So, but I want to access it, so I got to make sure that there's a parameter in my function. Okay, so handle change event, and then I can access like the value of the form. So basically here when I say event, that's the data that's being passed in from the event, this event object. And in there, there's a property called, or another object called target. And these are going to be information, all the data on the target element of the event. And I want the value of that element. So that's what this target is. So I have these two functions. So again, handle submit basically just says alerts the value. And then this event.prevent default thing, what it does is that when you submit a form, it automatically refreshes the page by its sort of default behavior. We don't want to refresh the page because then it's going to go back and pull in the whole website again from the server. And that kind of invalidates the whole point of a single page application, where we're trying to avoid that page refresh. We want everything to kind of happen within the page we've already loaded magically. So you're avoiding all this back and forth between the server as much, only when needed. So we want to event.prevent default means don't do that default behavior. Just don't refresh the page. Cool. Now here we're just setting the state to whatever the value of the box is. And this is happening on change. So essentially anytime, so this handle change function gets called here on the input form. So anytime there's a change, so it's an on change function, which means anytime there's a change in the value of this input box, it's going to run this handle change function. So that means I type in anything, the minute I type it in, it's going to go set the state back to whatever the value inside the box is. Okay, the event.target value. So this way I make sure that the information from the form is constantly in my state. I'm not necessarily having to go play around with the event target value everywhere else because I'm just moving it immediately into the state. And I can use my state throughout the function like I did here. Okay. So that way on submit, instead of me having to do event.state, event.target.value, I can just do this.state.value because the handle change kept all that information in my state. Sorry if that sounded really complicated. It does take a while to absorb that particular piece. So let's explore what I got here. H1, saying we're binding the forms. The first is that first input box that basically its values whatever the state is. The state value variable is, which is changing anytime we type something into this form. So this form has two inputs. One where we type in the box that we type into, and then input the submit button. And whenever the form is submitted, it's going to run the handle submit, because again, you always define the submit behavior in the form tag, not on the actual submit button tag. And then we added an on change function to this input box. So just to take a look again, if I type into this box, it changes the other box. If I try to type into this box, it doesn't let me because it's the value's sort of fixed to be whatever the state is. So if I were to change this to Alex and then I hit submit, technically when I type this in there, it automatically changed the state to Alex. So when I hit the submit, it's going to go pull from the state and say the name that was submitted is Alex. Cool. Okay, so the main takeaways is that how do I access the form value, so the event.target.value, and the good practice of making sure that you assign it to the state, so that way you're constantly doing all your data control and kind of using your state as your one source of all your data in the component. Because if you're going to have a class component, it's because you want that access to that state. And this does get really complicated after a while. So if you have a lot of components and they all have their own individual states and they're all manipulating that state in different ways, it gets really complicated really quick. So here's the thing you have to keep in mind. Well, later on, when you're starting to do larger and larger applications, you might decide to bring in a library like Redux. What Redux does, it's going to allow you to take all these different state variables and put them in one sort of big parent storage, like an application-wide state. That's why it's referred to as state management. So instead of having every component keep track of state on their own, you'll have this one big what they call a store, your Redux store, that'll contain all these variables, and you'll just constantly be pulling from the store the variables you need and changing them as you need. So I might change one variable that might change 3 or 4 components, because all those components are looking at that one store. But that's a journey for another day. Okay, we're still just doing the core React stuff, and we'll keep building on our React knowledge. So I'll see you guys later. Have a great day. Enjoy. Make sure you check out my website, alexmercedcoder.com. Join the Slack community, and thank you very much for watching, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you.